This week on The Futurists, Bill Barhydt.
You have two people in the United States that make the vast majority of the decisions on what your money is worth tomorrow. That's insane, okay? And by the way, they're getting it wrong time after time.
Welcome back to The Futurists. This week, we are going to get into the whole crypto stuff. I'm joined, of course, by my wonderful and talented co-host, Rob Tercek. Hey, Rob.
Hi. How you doing, Brett?
It's I'm actually in Dubai as we're recording this today, and which is it's pretty, it's a big crypto hub, of course. It particularly Abu Dhabi has really sort of doubled down on the sort of crypto community, and there is a big crypto community here in Dubai. I've actually got friends that have, crypto friends that have moved here, relocated to Dubai because they see it as very pro-friendly a space. So, I've been here working with some of the big banks and talking to Sama in the kingdom and stuff, and there's a lot of really interesting energy and stuff going on here. So.
Cool. They're trying to pivot away from oil, right?
Oh, yeah. I think generally speaking, MBS, on the Saudi side has this big 2030 plan that he's pushing. You've got NEOM, the city of the future, the line, of course. But as well as that, you've got Qatar, who's invested a ton in infrastructure for the World Cup. Of course, Dubai and Abu Dhabi, have done some incredible things over the last few years. But there's all sort of a healthy competition between all of these players as well as in this. But I think the changes that have happened in Saudi, that my first time to visit Saudi was many years ago, but the changes are enormous. And I know, Saudi gets a bad rap, but they have made some extraordinary progress over the last few years. But let's welcome our guest.
Hey.
But before that, actually, before we get to Bill, let's tackle the news. What have you got on the news from the future this week?
All right, the news from the future. This week we selected a few headlines from the cryptocurrency world. Why not? It's in the news, and there's a lot happening and seemed relevant for today's show. Sam Bankman-Fried, the founder of FTX, that recently collapsed. He's in the news again. So he postponed his testimony. He was invited by Maxine Waters, who's the chairwoman of the House Financial Services Committee, to testify in a House hearing on December 13th. But he can't find time to do that. However, he did find time to participate at New York Times Deal Book Summit recently, where he made the cryptic statement, "I didn't ever try to commit fraud." So we'll watch that space. That story's going to keep going on, and it'll be full of interesting turns and twists, no doubt about it. One that happened today, Senator Elizabeth Warren has sent a letter demanding information from Silvergate about FTX. Silvergate is one of the few U.S. banks that allows customers to transfer U.S. dollars into crypto exchanges. And both FTX and Alameda Research and several of the related companies had accounts at Silvergate. About 20 accounts. And so Senator Warren's demanding answers about that from the bank because she's trying to track down the $10 billion that went missing. As you may recall, $10 billion of customer funds were transferred from the FTX exchange to the related firm, Alameda Research, which looks like it was making investments and playing both sides of the table and so forth. So there's a real problem there. And it looks like Silvergate may have facilitated that. That's what the letter from Senator Warren alleges. It appears Silvergate facilitated the transfer of FTX customer funds to Alameda. In other news, arrest warrants were sent out for Terraform Labs co-founder Daniel Shin, 3 of his investors, and 4 of his engineers. This is the group that created the cryptocurrencies Terra, USD, and Luna that collapsed spectacularly a few months back. And the 3 Arrows founders. This is another firm that collapsed based in Singapore. These folks have resurfaced this week in Bali. Interestingly, Bali's in Indonesia, which is a jurisdiction that does not have an extradition treaty with the United States. So they just happen to be in Bali when everyone's trying to find these 2 guys. Three Arrows has not cooperated with investigators who are trying to find information related to the bankruptcy of that firm. They're based in Singapore, and $3 billion is gone missing. So $3 billion is owed to creditors. Meanwhile, those guys are relaxing on the beach. In spite of all this crazy shenanigans that are happening and the spectacular levels of fraud that have been revealed in the last couple of months, BlackRock's Charlie Fink says that the technology behind cryptocurrency remains relevant for the future. And he says he's supportive despite what he calls misbehavior by Sam Bankman-Fried. And Reuters announced today that Goldman Sachs intends to invest tens of millions of dollars into cryptocurrency startups. So clearly there remains interest in the space, despite all the hiccups, craziness, and chaos that's occurred. So those are the headlines from the future.
Yeah.
And now let's turn it over to our guest, Bill Barhydt. Bill, such a great pleasure to reconnect with you. Thanks for joining us on The Futurists.
Thanks, Robert. Good to see you, Brett. Yeah, great to be here.
Welcome, Bill. Yeah.
So, Bill, for folks who aren't familiar with you and Abra, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about what you're doing? What is Abra? How'd you get started? What brought you to that space?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a longtime technology entrepreneur, kind of a mixed background and working in both capital markets as well as early internet technology, all the way back to early 90s. And so via many permutations of working on payments companies, and developing markets projects in remittances, money transfer, microfinance, I became super excited about this movement towards integrating software and decentralization finally into money in the banking system, which is what got me really excited about Bitcoin when it first was launched, now over 10 years ago. Can't believe it's been over 10 years. But yeah, I was working in frontier markets on building payments and remittances and other basically financial products in places like Mexico, Philippines, Haiti, Central America, Southeast, other parts of Southeast Asia, India, even China. And basically, was running into brick wall after brick wall, dealing with the incumbent banks who were disincentivized to work with the bottom of the pyramid or even the lower middle part of the pyramid for that matter, to regulators who, you've seen the memes lately, probably, oh, well, they'll check the $600 transaction from Venmo, but, the senators can basically, invest in whatever they want with no disclosures, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like that, but like times a million. Right. So everything you do has a roadblock, regardless of who you're trying to help. Even if you're a nonprofit, I wasn't running a nonprofit. We actually had a nonprofit arm as well, but it doesn't really matter. It's just roadblock after roadblock. So when the Bitcoin white paper came out, I had been part of the cypherpunk community in the 90s that had looked at myriad e-money schemes. And the holy grail question for e-money since the beginning was, can you eliminate centralized trust and or solve the double spend problem, which is really part and parcel to the same problem. The double spend problem was basically, can two people have a copy of the same money or key in this case, and not have both people be able to spend the same money, which is the double spend problem.
Right, because it's so easy to copy a digital file on the internet, right? Sure. Basically, the internet's a copying machine.
Exactly.
So that's the problem. That's the core problem. People forget that they were trying to solve that back, things like digital gold back in the 1990s. It's a long time ago.
Well, you had, there were some of these formative cryptocurrencies, even if you discount things like Elon Musk and so forth. You had QQ coins in China. You had Second Life with Linden dollars. There were proto crypto, in those days. 90s. Yeah, exactly.
But they all basically had some component of centralized trust in the system with an off switch. And that's what the test for decentralized systems, right? I look at it like BitTorrent, right? They ask the RIAA where the off switch is for BitTorrent, and they will tell you there is none. And suing people doesn't actually manifest an off switch. And so, but that, like I said, that was the holy grail. If you eliminate the double spend problem, you've also eliminated the off switch in theory. And we thought that problem couldn't be solved. And I think in hindsight, I know why we thought the problem couldn't be solved once you see a viable solution. And that is, Bitcoin is clearly not created by an academic, because the idea of using every computer in the world to create a decentralized solution is orthogonal to the way any academic would think, right? There's nothing elegant about it. It's the most inefficient transaction processing system ever devised by man. But it turns out, if you want to solve the double spend problem, you have to rethink your requirements, right? Which is why we have this argument now between proof of work and proof of stake and all these other technologies, because what really matters is decentralization and security when it comes to eliminating centralized trust, and which ultimately usually means governments, central banks, and things like that. So when I saw this, after having hit roadblock after roadblock for all these years for the different projects I was working on, even going back to my Netscape days when you worked on SSL, if you understand how HTTPS works, even though it's an encrypted connection, the trust actually rolls uphill, meaning there's settings in the browser to determine whether or not that secure connection you have is truly secure. And there's what we call root authorities, which sounds very ominous, at the top of the chain that determine who you trust. So even with encryption on the internet for how you process credit cards, you're actually trusting someone in that kind of encrypted connection.
Some higher authority.
A higher authority. That's exactly what it is.
So it's a hierarchical system. It's baked into the internet. It's also like DNS, the same thing. Like,
even
in theory, it's decentralized, but DNS is highly centralized.
Highly centralized. It remains the ultimate attack vector for the internet. So this idea that you could have money that the more it got used, the more decentralized it becomes, the more more secure earlier transactions actually become was mind-blowing to me. Like like I said, it was so inefficient in its design relative to centralized databases that it was obvious that no academic would ever come up with this. But it turns out that it's the only solution that we've ever been able to come up with, and may actually be the only solution to the problem. Anyway, I was all in. And I said, this has got to be the future of money. And then the question becomes, around it, what's the future of banking? Right? Because on its surface, what Bitcoin does is eliminates the need for trusting a central bank to make the right decisions, trusting governments and central banks to create money out of thin air, eliminates the need for us to have to use gold rocks as the basis for a trusted monetary system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But around that money, we've built a banking system. Right. Most people have no idea how the banking system works. Right. They question crypto, but then, ask the average congressperson what a repo is in a bank and how money markets actually work, and you probably get a blank stare. Right. And so then the question becomes, okay, can we do better? Right. And your audience probably heard these acronyms, DeFi. Obviously, now everybody knows what a stablecoin is. And these things are basically being built out via this equivalent decentralized stack to replace now the banking system, the same way Bitcoin is proposing to completely change money on its head. And I like
some things. Let's recap a few things because you covered an awful lot. That's quite interesting. The first thing is the banking system is highly centralized, and we see evidence of that all the time. For instance, the sanctions against Russia that the United States imposed. Even the United States government can basically decide to cut a country off from the banking system at will.
We canceled the country in 12 hours.
That's right. And so there's an example of decentralization. Now, a lot of folks might support that, people who are supporters of Ukraine and so forth, but it does illustrate a kind of a risk in the global system.
That's not the point.
One country can make that call.
That's right.
The second idea there is that we often hear Bitcoin and blockchain in general, the blockchain that underlies the Bitcoin, but not just Bitcoin, all the blockchains that use proof of work. We often hear the complaint that they're inefficient, that they're grossly inefficient, right? What people don't realize is that's not a mistake. That's not a blunder. That's not a side effect. That's by design. That's baked in. That's the security model. That's intentional. Right. That inefficiency makes it incredibly impractical for someone to try to hack the whole network. And that's why they've been very secure.
But there's a corollary.
The Bitcoin blockchain hasn't been hacked.
Robert, there's a corollary to that. Watch Ray Dalio, when he wrote his book about the changing world order and the principles around that, published a video on YouTube where he talks about how the military-industrial complex basically supports the reserve currency. Now, I would posit that the military-industrial complex is infinitely more inefficient than Bitcoin in terms of pollution, money spent. I read a report that says this is like the umpteenth audit of the Pentagon, where 70% of their assets remain unaccounted for, and we're talking about trillions of dollars, right? And most of it is supposed to be accounted for in one building, and they still can't find it, right? And so I would posit that this is a move towards less inefficiency than the military-industrial complex, but it exists for a different reason. right?
I think I think
in
it's
addition, transparency. Let's add that, because every transaction that's on the blockchain can be audited, which you can't do with the Pentagon, right? The Pentagon refuses to be audited.
And these flaws exist in the financial system today. I mean, if we look at money laundering as an example, money laundering exposure is massive, and even though we spend billions of dollars a year trying to stop money laundering, the entire global financial system is only successful at eliminating about 1% of money laundering globally. So there are some serious functional problems, even with the fact that it's a very mature system. And yet people have implicit trust in that system because it's centralized, because banks have charters and the central bank looks after it. But there are serious flaws in the existing system.
And let's remember what the money laundering is about. Money laundering sounds nice. You're cleaning money. That's good. It's dirty. Clean it up. But what money laundering does is it funds terrorist groups, it funds arms deals, it funds drugs, it funds all sorts of illicit behavior, human enslavement,
and cash is the primary vehicle for that. Now, a lot of the criticism for Bitcoin and crypto is that it enables that, but the reality is that the global banking system and real estate in cities like London and Dubai and New York are an essential part of that. But Bill, I do want to ask you this question. I know you're a big fan, and I do want to get into the remittance function, and where Bitcoin sits in that, because the remittance business is a massive issue for financial inclusion and other things as well. But it has become clear over time. If you read the Bitcoin white paper and the intent of Bitcoin to be used as a means of value exchange, we don't hear a lot about Bitcoin as a means for value exchange and simple payments. We hear a lot more about the future value of Bitcoin, and it's become speculative. So, part of the problem is, I don't know whether this is a design flaw or just, the nature of humans, but, its potential to be really a revolutionary payments platform and digital currency has sort of been twisted a bit because now people are so speculative in their relationship to Bitcoin. But do you think that there is a way that we can solve that problem, or over time is it just going to become more trusted, less volatile, so that the speculative element disappears?
So I actually believe that we're already on the right path as it relates to Bitcoin and maybe some competing technologies within the crypto sphere. In 1976, so this obviously predates the internet, predates Bitcoin by extension, Friedrich Hayek wrote a book called The Denationalization of Money. And the idea was, what would happen if you took government out of the fiat money printing game? This was after we were off the gold standard and fiat was basically valued based upon whatever perception or value the public decided to give to it. And if you look at that book, it has basically a game plan for what would happen. And Bitcoin is basically playing out that game plan to the letter. He predicted that money would be hoarded if it was private, right, with a fixed float, because it would be so valuable, right? Because there would be no way for any central party to just arbitrarily print more. We have the meme in Bitcoin world, the printer goes burr. There's no more burr, right? And it would be hoarded until such time that it was so valuable that it made no more sense to hoard it anymore, right? And I believe that's what's playing out here. There's only 21 million Bitcoin, but it's subdivisible out to 8 decimal places. So you really have to think about the individual atomic units of Bitcoin at scale, which are these Satoshis. And at scale, you have basically billions upon billions of these Satoshis, but that's a fixed amount of Bitcoin, which is going to become so valuable at some point. Eventually, the early holders, right, are going to loosen up the purse strings and say, it makes no sense for me to hoard this and take it to the grave. It doesn't make no sense. Okay.
Now, hang on, Bill. I'm sorry to bust in here, but we've been hearing this now for 12 years about Bitcoin, right? There's a limited number. It's a fixed amount. It should be the hardest currency in the world, and it's a hedge against inflation. It might not be a medium of exchange that people are using every day, but it definitely has long-term value as a store of value, right? We've heard that message many, many times. Well, this year we've had record inflation, and by all accounts, Bitcoin should be soaring in value.
It
And
has.
it turns out it didn't. It crashed. It crashed along with the stock. So it's behaving like a tech stock.
Okay, so a few things. Let's stop. So first of all, I think it's something like 4 to 5x, actually more than 5x where it was at the trough before the inflation started. But even that is irrelevant to me. Okay, Bitcoin's price is moving as an exponentially growing asset, no different than Amazon did. Right, if you basically plot on a log chart its price from whenever it went public in the late 90s to today. Okay, prices had multiple 70+% drops. That is not the point. The point is, why is it an exponentially growing asset now, and what is it becoming? Okay, I don't claim that Bitcoin is an inflation hedge today. I claim that as it becomes hoarded, its value will increase to the point where nobody thinks in dollar terms anymore, because the dollar becomes irrelevant as the sound money. It has to happen. It's happened to every other fiat currency in history, and you're printing your way to irrelevancy. And so this is an exponentially growing asset whose adoption is growing faster than the internet did itself in the 90s, on the promise that it is going to become hard money at scale. And that is clearly right, what happens to something that has a fixed float. That's why it happens with collectibles and art and baseball cards or whatever you want. We're just doing this at global scale with a system that can actually be transferred without the need for middlemen. That's never happened before. But so
you're saying that if we zoom out and look at the long growth curve from 2009 to today, okay, there's occasional drops. And actually, historically, this isn't even the biggest crash that Bitcoin's had. It's the fifth largest crash, percentage-wise.
It's not.
And the long curve continues to grow. And you're saying that's an exponential growth chart. So hang tight, holders.
No, hodlers. It's hodlers.
But Robert, those are two different issues, right? Where I'm not saying that the price should be this or the price should be that. I'm saying that the exponential adoption is happening independent of the price. The money supply, the changes in money supply are what map the exponential adoption to the actual growth in price. And that's been true since the early 90s. Right.
So go back. Right, Bill.
Let's Rob, Bill, we got to expand on this a little bit. I do want to, bring back, this is an interesting debate, but where does this get us to? This is really, what we got to talk about. But let's, how about we do the quick fire round, have a quick break, and we can come back on that basis and talk about the future of digital money overall, because I think that's what we got to get to. That's the problem that Bitcoin's trying to fix. So how do we get there, in the end? But let's, if you're ready for it, Bill, we're going to give you the quick fire round. Here we go. What is the first instance of science fiction that you can ever recall being exposed to?
Star Trek. Yeah, I think growing up in New York City, there was reruns of Star Trek on late night, and when I should have been sleeping, I was probably watching on a black and white TV old episodes of Star Trek, and I was all in. I was hooked. I was like, this is unbelievable. This is the future that I want, and I want to be on that ship, going exploring the world, and I want all those gadgets in my bedroom, basically. In the meantime, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, isn't it? The communicator, the flip phone, a lot of those things, Alexa and Siri and, the computer. Yeah, there's a lot of analogies there. Is there a futurist or entrepreneur that you count as being very influential in your life?
Many. A lot of them your audience wouldn't even know because, now I'm an older guy, but I worked with Mark Andreessen and Jim Clark as a kid, and that was awesome. I mean, Mark Andreessen was younger than me. And there were so many talented entrepreneurs that I worked with in the early days. I mean, if you look at crypto, there's a few of us from our Netscape days that are CEOs of crypto companies now. Brendan Eich runs the Brave browser. Mike Belshie runs BitGo. I'm running Abra, of course, and so just since then, there's been so many people that have touched me, and whenever you're basically dealing with nonsense and crap that invariably happens in market cycles, there's always an entrepreneur that manages to re-excite me somehow. And the last few years, just looking at this kind of decentralization movement and some of the developers, just follow the developers in my world, right? Who's coming out of MIT and working on the next big project in this kind of global movement towards decentralization, whether it's, Ethereum or Solana and some of the other competing now Aptos and some some of the competing projects in the crypto space that are getting phenomenal entrepreneurial talents. But yeah, I mean, in my life, there's been probably dozens of people that I can, sit down and think of that have had a dramatic impact and significant influence on my life.
Excellent. Now, of course, this show is about futurists. So is there anyone that you can, who do you think, from a futurist perspective or a forecasting perspective, has been particularly good at making predictions about the?
I am a big believer in kind of this whole movement towards singularity and the growth of exponential tech and Moore's law and kind of being pretty damn accurate in predicting that. And I've come to rely on that and put disbelief aside. And so, folks like Peter Diamandis and Ray Kurzweil have been very instrumental in kind of enabling me to accept what I intuitively believe. And then at some point, it's like, to the early discussion, Star Trek, it sounds like science fiction. So in the early 90s, it was very obvious to me that Moore's law was going to enable things like smartphones and little video handheld phones that you would carry around with you, and everything else. It was science fiction, but you have to suspend the disbelief part of science fiction and just do the math. And those trending, like people like Peter and Ray, have been very instrumental in my life in terms of enabling me to suspend that disbelief to just do the math.
All right, and a special one for this week. Last question. Who is Satoshi Nakamoto?
So I did say that I don't think that Satoshi was an academic, or at least the primary developer. I don't think it was one person. I think it was a group for different reasons.
Have you heard the theory of the four Satoshis?
It sounds like the samurai. No, I haven't heard the theory of the four Satoshis.
It's Brock Pierce told me this. So Brock, of course. So and he we should get into this after the break or offline. But
maybe it's what I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah, he's made that argument that Hal Finney had the private key, and that's why none of Satoshi's bitcoins.
Yeah, I think Hal Finney was genuinely brought in right after the white paper. So I don't think he was the original ideator of the idea of blockchain and mining and the individual components. But I do think that he was heavily involved in rewriting a lot of the original code into C++, which I think pissed off Satoshi. Cool. As a non-academic, I think Satoshi was probably older and probably came up in the assembly. And if you look at the way the opcodes for Bitcoin work, some of it reminds me of the old kind of Pascal P codes and stuff like that. This was clearly somebody who came up through the assembly world and not somebody who came up through modern functional programming. And so that's why I think
interesting insight.
But I do think that there's some communications that are inconsistent in terms of being one person. So I'm pretty
I agree. There's different flavors of comms in there.
Yeah.
Listen, that's great. Thank you for your answer. Let's have a quick break, and when we come back, I want to get into the future of digital money and what, let's play it out. How do we get to the full potential of what we've been talking about with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and now, the emergence of CBDCs and so forth. You're listening to The Futurists. We'll be right back after these words from our very kind sponsors. Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific, and the FinTech 5. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network, and Next Gen Banker. For information about all our podcasts, go to Provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Welcome back to The Futurists. This is part 2 with our guest this week, Bill Barhydt from Abra. And Bill, one of the things I want to make sure we cover is Abra's business, what you actually do at Abra. And I think the way to set that up is to talk a little bit about the remittances businesses. One thing I was surprised to learn when I lived in Asia is how much people depend on Western Union and similar services to send money back home. For instance, a huge percentage of the Philippines. Many of those people work in other countries, and every month they're sending money back home. But candidly, Western Union's a ripoff. And this is an inspirational idea for people who want to disrupt an incumbent company that's highly centralized, that takes too much for a service that they offer. Talk a little bit about the remittances racket.
Sure. So money transfer is definitely one part of our business. We actually have a retail business, a private banking, and an institutional business. And I'll start off addressing the remittance question, which was some of the things I was working on before we started Abra. And yeah, so to your point, there are a few large centralized players that have basically cornered this market over multiple decades. Western Union, MoneyGram, and then there are a few kind of upstarts that have tried to take pieces of that. Zoom, which became part of PayPal, and Remitly, which is a standalone company, but they're single-digit percentages of the overall space versus the two large incumbents. And some banks offer remittance services now. But the idea is that somebody who doesn't have a bank account or doesn't want to spend $50, $60 on wire fees or have the money take 3 to 4 days to get there via Swift based settlement process can go to a retail store, hand the person behind the counter some money, fill out a long form, show their ID. And based upon some internal systems at Western Union, another window, let's say back in Mexico, could be visited by the same family member or a member from the same family with a pickup code, and that store, tienda, would basically hand out the equivalent of the $250 in cash in pesos. And
less the huge fee that they take off the top.
Yeah, right. Minus the fee, or the fees added on top, depending upon how you do the transaction. And in the background, what Western Union is doing is they have banking relationships all over the world, and they're using those relationships to do settlements with these retailers every day. And so that the retailer is handing out cash temporarily, and then Western Union is making them whole minus the cut that they have to pay them for handing out the cash in the first place. So let's say that you hand out $300, they may reimburse them $305 or something like that. And the $5 being, a fee for basically, effectively, they've lent Western Union money for a few hours while the customer has picked it up until they pay them back. Okay. Now, there's actually a lot of hands in the pie here that have to get paid. There's Western Union, there's the retailer, there's the banks in the middle. In some cases, there's correspondent networks. And so there's a reason why the global floor on remittance prices in extremely competitive markets is somewhere probably around 3%-ish. And then in less competitive markets in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, the fee could approach, 10%, which is an incredible amount of money. And it's all about competition, but there is a floor because of the number of hands in the pie who won't participate for free. Okay. So clearly, in order to optimize those fees, you need to eliminate these hands in the pie. There's no other way. So the more hands in the pie you can eliminate, the lower the fee should get. Right. So Bitcoin solves a couple of these problems because you can do transfers peer-to-peer, right, without the need for the banks. But the question is, how do you get the Bitcoin in on the send side, and how do you get the Bitcoin out on the receive side? And this was one of the ideas that we had for Abra, because in theory, most people sending money have a bank account, even immigrants. Okay, it's the recipient that does it. Okay, so if you could use something like ACH in the US to buy the Bitcoin, send the Bitcoin, and then use the same cash window to effectively get the cash out, which amounts to selling the Bitcoin, you've eliminated 2 out of the 3 hands in the pie. Right, in theory. So anyway, so we've played with myriad versions of this. We have hundreds of thousands of consumers in the Philippines and Mexico and Central America and parts of the other parts of India, that Bangladesh, that now use this to do everything from going to a window to buy stable coins that they send to other people, that they then use to buy Bitcoin and speculate as savings, because they see that as a better savings model than trusting their banks. Right. A lot of the countries that we deal with have consumers who've seen their banking systems fail and confiscate their cash. So they end up using Abra as kind of an off-the-grid savings account.
I've heard that.
Cases, which is super interesting.
Yeah, I've heard that. Sometimes people don't want to be paid in their local currency if they're doing international work, like on Fiverr.com or something. They'd rather be paid in some stablecoin.
Yep. And then we have our private banking business, which actually is the fastest growing part, which is not only in the US, but even in developing markets where people are using Abra to now invest in cryptocurrencies, do large transactions where they need to send money around. But in particular, we're helping a lot of wealthy clients. We have kind of large stable of celebrities now that use Abra to manage crypto, manage their wealth. So one of the things I love about what we've built is we have super wealthy people using the same app used by poor farmers in Guatemala.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like it. And crypto has been a big and kind of leveling enabler for all of this. And for different reasons, right? Some people are speculating, some people are sending money, some people are doing payments, some people use it as their bank account, and we don't care. And then we even have an institutional arm that services the likes of the Goldmans of the world.
There have been some recently. The big scandals have occurred around the exchanges, right? So that's the point where we go from the crypto world into the fiat money world. That's the exchange point. Does Abra compete with the exchanges? Are you like an exchange, or are you do a different function?
So exchanges have what we call an order book, which basically takes a bid and an ask and maps a buyer and a seller. We don't run an exchange. We don't run order books. We actually route orders. So it's more like the FX.
But you do custody.
Yeah. So we more like the FX window at the airport. They're using different banks to do your exchange. And so we use different exchanges to route those transactions. So if you want to buy Bitcoin for cash, or if you want to swap your Bitcoin to Ethereum or your Ethereum to, BSC, Binance token, Abra will do that by routing to different exchanges. Or if you want to use your bank account to buy and sell crypto, we integrate with different banks who basically process those transactions and convert the cash to stablecoins for us, so that we're only holding the stablecoins, not the cash. And then, we have a lending business, which will allow you to park Bitcoin and then borrow against it, for example, which is we have customers all over the world from super wealthy folks to people who, may have saved up $1,000 worth of Bitcoin, don't want to sell it, but want to borrow $50 this week. Right. And so basically all kinds of banking functions now that are centered around the crypto model.
If you would consider Abra centralized or decentralized?
So as a company, there's no such thing as a decentralized company, right? So we're a company, so obviously we're centralized. We have an off switch and an on switch. Mostly we're generally on because we're open 24/7. But we use decentralized technology to enable the services we provide to consumers and businesses. In other words, we use DeFi in some places to generate yield. We use DeFi to process loans in some cases, but we also have CeFi versions of lending and yield. And we use Bitcoin and Ethereum rails to also move money around. And so it's a centralized banking entity that uses crypto decentralized rails to enable the services we provide.
Okay,
Bill, I want to jump into in this conversation, you've talked a lot about the rails. You've talked a lot about the functional disparity in the system, the need for decentralization, and so forth. But what's the core problem with fiat currencies, beyond the cost of sending them, from a functional perspective, in the world we're moving to over the next 20, 50, 100 years? What is the functional deficiency in fiat currency that
Sure.
crypto and stable coins or these variants might solve?
Sure. So basically the global banking system is this complicated hub-spoke network of central banks in different countries with, large banks connected to them and smaller banks via correspondence connected to the larger banks. And moving money around basically forces you to move from outside of the wheel into the center spoke, then settling via another correspondence to another network in another country. And so moving small amounts of money, for example, cross-border, is effectively impossible. Right, because the cost of moving between those hub and spokes, if you're moving from in between networks, in other words, going from the US to Germany, is untenable. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is, even if you're doing micro transactions, every country has its own system. US ACH, UK has Faster Pay, Mexico has SPAY. Eurozone has SEPA, all basically variants on the same thing, which basically allow you to push money, in most cases, from your bank account into some other account, either for a merchant or another consumer. The US has a pull version of that as well, but most countries do push because it's more secure. But they're all incompatible, which is why you end up with Venmo and PayPal and different mobile money schemes in different countries. So there's no commonality in any of that. We still use checks. And this is
right, but that's a problem with the piping, right? The transmission vector. It's not a problem. There's not a flaw in the design. It's a flaw in the monetary system.
Sure.
Is it a flaw in money?
So money and banking have their own sets of problems. Okay, the biggest problem with fiat money today is centralized control, right? Meaning you have two people in the United States that make the vast majority of the decisions on what your money is worth tomorrow. That's insane. Okay, and by the way, they're getting it wrong time after time. Right. So if you look at what's happened the last few years, they basically have been manipulating interest rates and the overall money supply, right, to try to control and manage an economy. And at scale, it doesn't work. That's why we have these 80-year debt cycles that Ray Dalio has been writing about. Meaning, by definition, 2% inflation, it doesn't sound like a lot, but that is a crazy number. Over the course of the lifetime, that eliminates the vast majority of the value of your money. That's the problem with the monetary system. Yeah. What I'm also describing are the problems with the banking system. So as I said, I think that Bitcoin and the idea of a deflationary cryptocurrency solves the problems of the monetary system. I think that smart contracts, the promise of Ethereum, other competing technologies to Ethereum solve the problems with the banking system. Those are two different things, okay? Right. Because the money doesn't have to be Bitcoin. It doesn't have to be dollars. It could be gold rocks, but the problems with the banking system remain. And so it just so happens that decentralization can enable the solution to both problems.
And some of this infrastructure is quite immature, right? It's not ready for prime time. Some of this infrastructure, when you say the banking system, it may be inefficient, it may be inelegant, it might not be compatible, but it works. Versus the piping for the crypto world, it's still a work in progress. And that's why we see these periodic flaws.
Well, I'm going to take a little bit of exception to that. Talk to people in Venezuela, talk to people in Argentina, talk to people in Turkey, talk to people in the Ukraine, talk to people in Russia. The banking system and the monetary system, neither of them work in those countries, okay? People are adopting crypto in these markets because they have no choice. Right. Well, go look at the writings from the Human Rights Foundation that has been covering this and actually making donations to help people get into the system as basically a backup to the fact that their governments are confiscating their money, that they can't do cross-border transactions. Right. We have employees in the Ukraine who were basically stuck, and the only way they could transact was with crypto. And so it's not just about what works for us if we're trying to ACH $1,000 in the US. Of course that works. Okay, but we're also the people who run the system, right? And there's 140 countries that don't run the system.
Right. So the view from outside the United States is going to be significantly different than the view in the U.S. system.
Of course.
Okay, but then how did El Salvador go so sideways? Right, they lost $60 million on their attempt to make Bitcoin a national currency.
Okay, so those are two different things, right? So let's break it down. El Salvador is unique in that they're one of the few countries in the world that actually used already the dollar. Okay, so they didn't have to turn off an internal monetary system. And the people of El Salvador are very skeptical of their dependency upon the United States to do the right thing for their monetary system. Okay. Now, they still are a dollar-based system. That hasn't changed. What they said is, in parallel, we're going to run a test to use Bitcoin as a parallel currency. Now, my opinion is it was too early to do that. Given all the things we talked about earlier around technology adoption and migration towards private money, I understand why they did it. I think it's a very interesting test. But if you look at the playbook that I was talking about earlier, it's too early. So I actually would not have done this, but they did it already. It's fine. Now, they chose to also speculate on the value of Bitcoin versus the dollar. That may actually turn out to be the smarter of the two bets at scale. I realize your comment notwithstanding that the price has fallen, but if you actually look at the value of a deflationary asset or an exponentially growing technology, combined with the fact that it's valued in dollars, where the money supply historically only goes up, right? That's why stocks go up in value over time in mass, right? Is because the money supply goes up. It's got to be a good bet at scale, unless something breaks in the technology. I realize in the short term, that it doesn't look like a good bet, but that doesn't matter because they don't seem to need the money right now. So they should be holding it for 15 years anyway. But anyway,
let's focus on the future, because we're right at that point now where we're talking about governments experimenting different opportunities outside the United States. Brett, do you want to ask a question?
The central bank digital currency development we're talking about here is even though that is programmable money, even though it can be used for underpinning smart contracts potentially and things like that, which is a big key part of automating the world, supply chain automation and so forth, improving cross-border trade, seems like it's still going to be fraught with these functional issues of the system that you have, right? Because if you have lots of different geographically based CBDCs, you get the same difficulty you have in the current system, particularly for Forex and so forth. However, there is a lot of conversation now about regional CBDs. You see China doing a partnership and a bridge between the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and the central bank in China for creating a bridge. So it could be that we see these pan-regional CBDCs emerge. And from a wholesale trading perspective, it would give these central banks some continuity, and it would solve many of the problems you're talking about. So when we talk about this future world, smart contracts, supply chain mechanics, and so forth, where is the advantage that crypto and these tokens have versus what's emerging out of the central bank prototypes of CBDCs?
Okay, so there's three things you need to understand, in my opinion, about this idea of a central bank-based digital currency. And the first point that I would make is relative to where we are today as a planet. We are in a late stage debt cycle. Unless this time is different versus the last 700 years, we are in a late stage debt cycle. And Bretton Woods was the whole idea that to the victor goes the spoils, and the victor was us. And we defined a new monetary system. That system slowly fails once you reach the peak cycle, which we reached in the 60s. Okay. It was exacerbated by Vietnam, which is why we came off the gold standard. And many smarter people than myself have written about it. At the end of that debt cycle, the world is forced to take sides because the bond markets start to break, debt becomes untenable, right? And the bond markets are invariably what lead to these world wars and new debt cycles. Follow the money. Now, it just so happens, but that's point one, is that we are in a late stage debt cycle.
Dalio's position.
Exactly. Right? But independent of central bank digital currencies, the world is forced to choose sides, settling oil in rubles, looking at China basically forcing other trading partners to use the digital yuan, et cetera, et cetera. Point two is that it just so happens that the technology for creating these central bank digital currencies, it now exists at the same time that the world is being forced to choose sides, which is something we didn't have before in previous debt cycles. Okay. Now, that's interesting because it makes it much easier in many cases for non-US trading partners to be pushed by China into this, using this currency for settlement.
But hang on, why shouldn't China do that? They're going to be the biggest economy in the world shortly. They already, in terms of the financial system, Chinese banks have twice the tier one capital of banks in the US. They have twice the assets of the banks. If you're looking at the global banking system, it's all China, right? They've got the largest fintech, the largest wallet ecosystem. Alipay and Tencent WeChat Pay do twice the volume of all the plastic card schemes in the world, right? So if you're looking at the future of banking, it's in China. It's not in the US. The US has already lost that battle.
Sure. So that may very well be true, and I agree with most of those points. But the most important point here being that the world is going to be forced to take sides regardless. It just so happens that we have this new technology happening at the same time. And if I'm China, what you're saying makes perfect sense. As an American, I have major concerns with this, but as an American, I have major concerns.
But America's done the same thing 100%. To the rest of the world.
That's the whole idea of to the victor goes the spoils. That's the whole idea of the military-industrial complex, was to use Navy ships to make sure that the money basically maintained its value because the commerce could continue to happen. That was the whole idea of all of this. And as an American, I accepted that there was no other way. And we exported democracy, and that was the price for all of this. That's why we police the world. I totally get it. But that leads to point three, which is what is going to happen vis-a-vis this adoption? Because there's two end games. Well, okay. So the first end game for CBDCs is basically like it's an interim solution because all you're doing is putting a very pretty coat of paint on a dilapidated house, because it doesn't prevent them from increasing the money supply another 100-fold, which is what they're going to do. Whether it's paper money, electronic settlement via the Fed, CBDCs in your smartphone, it makes no difference. The money supply is just going to continue to explode. All this does is it says, okay, the Fed can make payments directly into people's bank accounts. They can monitor what you're doing, which is a big concern, right? They can't do that with Ethereum, but they can if they make their own blockchain for this stuff, right? They can't do that with paper money. That's a big concern. But again, this third point that I want to make is it's just an interim solution because the money system is breaking anyway.
So this gets to the heart of it. This is the futurists, after all.
Yep.
So then let's go big picture. 50 years out, right? What does it look like? How has this system resolved itself? If you were, obviously we're experimenting with all of this now, but what is the end game? Is it self-sovereign currencies or combined with self-sovereign identity? How does this all wash out? Put the futurist hat on.
I'll give you my take on money, and then I'll give you my take on banking. I think in terms of existing monetary systems, the vast majority of fiat currencies are going to fail. You've got, 150? I think 135 of them will be gone within 20 years. And I'm not exaggerating.
I think that's fair. Yep.
Once it happens, the cascading effect, it's going to be like, whoa, what happened? All right. You're going to end up with dollars, euros, maybe yen, pounds. You might even get the Deutschmark reintroduced if the Eurozone falls apart, and obviously the RMB. And countries will be asked to take sides as part of this fourth turning that I think is coming. And that will be mostly for ephemeral transactions, meaning that we have to settle the transaction somehow. But for actual storage of wealth, none of these currencies are going to succeed because they're inflationary by nature. You need a deflationary asset at scale with the fourth turning, which is what we did post Bretton Woods. We needed a deflationary currency, so we created one and collected all the world's gold in order to do that. Well, now we don't need to do that because Bitcoin gives us the same effect. I don't know if it's going to be Bitcoin, but it is going to be a deflationary digital currency. I don't see any other way out of it.
Why can't it be a carbon coin, which prioritizes the environment over actually monetary value?
Maybe, but it has to solve.
Why don't we come up with a different value exchange system?
It could be a competing technology. All I'm saying is if it has to solve the problems that I'm describing, because Either it doesn't, either it solves the problems I'm describing, or this is the first time in hundreds of years that it doesn't.
All right. Last question.
And then on the banking side, I believe that the banks which are closed more than they're open are moving towards a global, decentralized, always-on system with no off switch, where all of these myriad regulators are going bye-bye. There's no way.
It's going to be just AI-based.
AI, but blockchain, all kinds of global settlement systems, et cetera, et cetera. I totally agree with you there. And that's going to happen faster than the other part with the monetary systems.
Let's talk about a computable economy. That's one of the things that some folks have gotten very excited about with the advent of cryptocurrencies, the idea that you can now have visibility into all the transactions and thereby compute an economy. A radical concept. I don't really know if I have my brain wrapped around it, but I'd be curious to hear your perspective about the long-term implications of that as more and more transactions move into the crypto space.
Well, it's just that the smart economy needs smart money, right? It needs programmable.
What does that mean? They'll put some substance behind it.
Okay, so you have to break it down, right? So the challenge with crypto markets this year have been that the decentralized technology has worked flawlessly. The centralized entities have been a disaster.
That's right.
So centralized entities rehypothecate. And if you go back in history to the banking problems of the last 30 years, it's been leverage, right? And rehypothecation is the process for enabling the leverage in a centralized entity, meaning you're borrowing borrowed money, effectively.
That's what FTX did, right?
Well, there's also fraud there in terms of actually moving money around, but you're basically taking collateral and reusing the collateral. It's two sides of the same coin, and so the idea of this DeFi model is that if you eliminate the centralized entities, and I say that knowing that I'm one of them, that in theory that rehypothecation or over leverage, it can't be stopped, but it's happening. Whereas with long-term capital management, I've heard stories where all the largest lenders to LTCM didn't know that they were all the largest lender to LTCM, and they were reusing the same damn collateral over and over again.
Right.
This is exactly what happened this year with Three Arrows and,
sounds like collateralized debt obligations, right?
Exactly. It's the same.
It sounds a lot like it. It's a
2008
systemic
was
problem.
the same thing. That has nothing to do with crypto. That has to do with centralized actors trying to manipulate the system to use leverage to make more money when the government is printing money, right? And so the promise of DeFi is we can't necessarily stop that, but we can see that it's happening.
All right. Well, listen, in the interest of time, we have run over, and I'm respectful of your time, Bill, but I just want to ask you one final question.
Sure.
30, 50 years out, big picture futurist, this time not about crypto, not about the banking system. What makes you bullish on the future? If all of these, obviously clearly painful elements are coming with this conflict between China and US and these, collapse of these systems, what makes you really positive about the future of humanity over the emerging decades?
Honestly, it's technology. I think we're approaching this convergence is happening, which is amazing to me that it's happening at the same time that we're basically nearing the end of this debt cycle, meaning that we're less than 15 years away from reaching a singularity moment in computational capabilities where computers will be able to solve problems in ways that we never thought of. And we have no idea what the implications of that are because we can't solve those problems. And so we're about to enter an age of artificial intelligence and combined with decentralization and democracy, which is spreading now.
All bets are off.
Right.
All bets are off.
I just don't see that ending poorly. I actually see it ending really well. I'm of the abundance and post scarcity theory on this as well. I know Robert and I have had this conversation on numerous episodes of the show, but I think AI is going to usher in incredible benefits for humanity because of all those things you talked about. Yep.
Bill, it's great to chat with you again. Very lively conversation, and thanks again. How do people follow you personally and keep in touch with what you're doing at Abra?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Bill Barhydt on Twitter. Try to be reasonably active, even though I have a day job. You can also follow Abra Global on Twitter, and obviously you can sign up for Abra at abra.com. And we want to be basically everybody's one-stop shop for basically buying access to crypto, moving money around, whatever it is you want to do. We want to basically help you do it.
Super. Well, Bill, it's been a great pleasure having you on the show. You've given us really good answers to some complex questions. You clarified the matter for me. Thanks for that. Thanks for joining the Futurists this week. And I want to give a shout out to the folks that work on the show, Kevin Hirschhorn, our engineer and producer, Elizabeth Severance, who's also a producer, and the friendly folks at Provoke Media who help us make the show and distribute the show. The show's doing great. And if you're enjoying these conversations, I would really, really appreciate it if you could give us a 5-star review. That helps other people find the show. And the good news there is it's working. The show's been growing rapidly. Dare I say it's growing at an exponential rate. It's going up every week. The number of downloads, listeners, it's on every platform now.
It's insane, right?
And it's approaching the #1 futurist podcast in the world. We're very thrilled about the progress, and we appreciate it greatly when folks give us feedback about guests we should invite, topics that we should cover, questions that we should ask. We welcome that, and we encourage it. And so we want to thank all of you for doing that. So please do give us a shout out if you can, and that would help us a great deal. And we will see you in the future. Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.